Okay, before we do get started, don't forget to go straight down to the comment section and just let me know down below which one you actually consider to be the better weapon. And also, don't forget to skip right towards the end of the video. Don't listen to a single thing that I say, just check out the final score, get really mad about it, and just let me know in the comment section as to how you feel about it with a very angry response. But for today, we're going to be comparing the Blasphemous Blade to the Darkwind Greatsword, which is definitely like the definitive two best weapons in the entire game. Now, this is honestly going to be like the Elden Ring equivalent of like Goku versus Saitama. There is no need to compare them. They're very good weapons. If you're confused as to which one you want to go with, one is just for faith, one is just for intelligence, whatever one like looks coolest to you, which one you like aesthetically, just go with that one. But for the sake of doing a comparison and breaking it down and actually milking content, we're going to go ahead and make this video. But as always with our versus battles, we're going to have a bunch of different categories, have them fight each other, and whichever one ends up with the most points is going to be the winner. Anyway, let's get started. Now to just give a quick little overview on both weapons, they're both great swords, both get very similar movesets, both have very similar range as well. One's just going to be your faith-based option, one's just going to be your intelligence-based option, and they both get very similar scalings in those regards as well. But both of them just have like extremely overpowered weapon skills, to which they just have just ridiculous projectile attacks that just do a lot of damage, and can go relatively far. Now the Blasphemous Blade is just a regular weapon skill, you just keep spamming it over and over again, and it consumes 30 FP. Now, as for the Darkwind Greatsword, its weapon skill is just a buff, of which just adds just more frost damage, and actually just adds more magic damage as well, and turns your heavy attacks into just projectiles. So yeah, if you didn't know what these weapons are, now you do. Okay, to start off with, we're going to be comparing damage. Now, Blasphemous Blade does actually get a B scaling in Faith, C scaling in Strength and Dexterity, but it actually does scale better with that Strength compared to Dexterity, despite them both being a C scaling. So speccing into a build at 50 Faith and 35 Strength, the total AR is actually 752. As for the Darkwind Greatsword, it actually does get a B scaling in Intelligence and only D scalings in Strength and Dexterity, so going all into Intelligence is probably going to be the better play. So the build with 60 Intelligence, 20 Strength and Dexterity, you have 748 AR, which is going to be a bit less, but they're still roughly basically the exact same thing. But testing out their weapon skills, if we're going to test it out on my guy Steven the Omen, the good old reliable, the weapon skill of the Blasphemous Blade does actually end up dealing 15 damage. Now with the Darkwind Greatsword weapon skill, the skill itself actually only buffs the weapon, which the buff itself does actually turn your heavy attacks into a projectile. So that heavy projectile attack ends up dealing 20 damage, which being that actually has less range as well, it might seem that the Blasphemous Blade is going to be the better option, but obviously the Darkwind Greatsword does this projectile attack for free. So you do have to keep that in mind, but one thing we haven't taken into account is that there are buffs in the game. So using the Blasphemous Blade alongside Alexander's Shard, Ritual Sword, Talisman, Fire Scorpion Charm, and put on things like Golden Vow and Flame Grant Me Strength spells because you do have access to faith-based spells. Against Steven, you end up doing 3,548 damage. Now, we actually can boost this damage a bit further if you use things like Hellish Brewery instead of Flame Grant Me Strength. Now, the downside to Hellish Brewery is that you end up just taking a bunch more damage. I'd rather just stick with Flame Grant Me Strength for the most part. But just for the sake of maximizing damage, with Hellish Brewery actually ends up doing 4,552 damage. Now, you actually can boost this a lot further if you put on the Black Dumpling Helmet and proc Madness upon yourself, and that buff will last about 20 seconds, and the damage against Steven ends up being over 5,000. Now with Darkwind Greatsword, you actually have access to more types of buffs. You can get things like the Shard of Alexander, Ritual Sword Talisman, you can get Magic Scorpion Charm instead, but you also can put on Godfrey's Icon Talisman. Because yes, even though you're doing the heavy attack for its projectile, it's still going to scale with things like the Shard of Alexander and Godfrey's Icon for whatever reason. Now Godfrey's Icon will actually end up boosting the charge attack damage that you actually end up getting, which the Blasphemous Blade weapon skill cannot be fully charged, so actually doesn't benefit off this. So just using these talismans and using the Golden Vow Ash of War, because you can just use that whenever, you'll end up doing 3,632 damage, which actually ends up being more damage than the Blasphemous Blade did with Flame Grant Me Strength and Golden Vow. But we actually can push this damage even further as well, because you can use things like Terra Magica, which is just 35% more damage. Now, yes, this is going to involve you just standing inside of the pool. And you actually also can use the Jellyfish Shield, because normally when you have the Jellyfish Shield on, you can't really use other weapon skills because it would just end up defaulting to the Jellyfish Shield weapon skill. But being that our heavy attack is actually going to be what's doing the damage, we don't have to worry about that. So we can just leave on the Jellyfish Shield, use its skill, which is going to be 20% more damage. And with these things combined, we're going to be doing over 5,500 damage, which is going to be a lot more than what the Blasphemous Blade ended up doing. And that's for a total amount of AR with the weapon itself. With all these buffs, the Darkwind Greatsword can get well over 1,900 damage, whereas the Blasphemous Blade, with as many buffs as you actually can give it, it's going to be a little over 1,300 AR. Now, a couple of things we've yet to take into account. One, the Blasphemous Blade weapon skill does actually have a hitbox with the weapon itself, so at point blank range, you might end up doing more damage to the Blasphemous Blade. But another thing with the Darkwind Greatsword is that it actually does proc Frost, and actually very quickly as well, especially when you do have it buffed. And when you actually end up proccing Frost, you're doing 20% more damage, of which when Frost is procced against an enemy, the Darkwind Greatsword is going to be doing a lot more damage than a Blasphemous Blade ever will. And combined with the fact that the Darkwind Greatsword weapon skill can be spammed a lot quicker, you probably could just do a lot more DPS as well. And one other type of damage we've yet to take into account is poise damage. Now, being that both of these are actually great swords, the light attack poise damage is going to be the exact same. But as for their weapon skills, the Darkmoon Greatsword heavy attack actually does 35 stance damage, whereas Taker's Flame and the Blasphemous Blade only does 22 stance damage. So with the Darkmoon Greatsword, you can be doing a lot more damage, and it can be poise breaking a lot quicker as well. So yeah, due to how many buffs you can stack and the poise damage, I'll probably end up giving this to the Darkmoon Greatsword. Okay, now next up, I want to talk about ease of use and how easy the weapons are to attain as well. Now, as for the Blasphemous Blade, you get this one about halfway through the game, off of not that challenging of a boss. I did have an entire video talking about how I grabbed a Blasphemous Blade and actually maxed it out within the first 2 hours of the game. I'll just have that video linked down below. But do keep in mind that video is actually going to be more for like experienced players and not really beginners. But as for the Darkmoon Greatsword though, this one is going to be off Rani's questline right at the end, so you can get this one a lot later in the game, which is unfortunate, and actually does have higher requirements as well. But being that you do get it later in the game, at that point you probably end up going to have about 38 intelligence anyway. But as for how easy these weapons are to use, they both have their pros and cons. The Darkmoon Greatsword, the reason why it's probably not going to be as easy is because that you have to constantly use the weapon skill over and over again. Now, it does last 60 seconds, which is still nice, but in the middle of a boss fight, it's probably end up going to wear off and you might have to reuse it again. And the buff itself is what's going to pretty much make the entire weapon. If you don't have that buff active, it's just a very average weapon at best. But what makes it good is that after you do use the buff, you basically just get free projectile attacks. So you don't have to worry about your FP at all. Don't have to allot your flasks into more blue flasks. And also that means you probably don't have to spec into much mind as well. But as for the Blasphemous Blade, this weapon skill does actually consume 30 FP. So you probably have to spec into a little bit of mind and probably have a bit of blue flasks as well. But that's perfectly fine because this weapon skill and the weapon itself does actually give you a bunch of healing properties, which is obviously just going to be very nice to have. Just being able to heal on every single hit on the weapon skill means you don't have to have many healing flasks, means you can trade out a whole bunch, so you can just use it whenever, and in most cases you end up just winning the trade. And another thing is that the weapon skill actually does have some more range as well, so you can sit at a much more comfortable distance and end up just hitting. The fact that it does get more range, I'm probably going to end up leaning more towards the Blasphemous Blade as it being the more easier weapon to use. But honestly, you can't really go wrong with either, they're still pretty easy. Okay, next up, I want to talk about build synergy. Now, this basically means how well this weapon will actually pair alongside different types of builds. Now, both these weapons do get a B scaling, one for intelligence and one for faith, so a lot of it is going to come down to what type of build you do want to go with, whether it be faith or intelligence. Now, I do have a whole dedicated video talking about faith versus intelligence, but if you want me to break it down, intelligence-based spells tend to have the better attacking options, whereas faith-based spells tend to have more variety, and they get better support-based spells. Things like Golden Vow and Flame Memory Strength is really nice, and it's actually going to pair very nicely alongside the Blasphemous Blade. But as you saw in the damage category, using things like Terra Magica and the Golden Vow Ash of War is still going to be perfectly fine. Now, one thing I want to talk about as well in terms of build synergy is the scalings. Now, the Blasphemous Blade actually does get a good strength and faith-based scaling, which having a weapon that actually scales well into two different stats can be good and bad. It can be good because it means your total overall damage is going to be really nice, because if you max out one stat, you can just go into the other one and still benefit greatly there. But for this weapon in particular, its skill, Taker's Flame, actually scales primarily off faith. So the more points you put into strength, the less you're actually really going to benefit in terms of that weapon skill. So if you do want to maximize your weapon skill damage, you have to go all into faith, but that's going to hurt your total AR that you actually get with like your light attack combo and stuff. And another reason why having split types of scalings as well can actually hurt your weapon could be the total overall spell damage. Because once again, if you're just going half into strength and half into faith, you're not going to really be doing as good as spell damage. Now, yes, you can use things like the Clawmark seal, but if you did check out my seal ranking video, you would know that if you have just more faith than in strength in general, you're just better off going with the faith-based seals that is going to perform a lot better. And even at higher levels, the Clawmark seal doesn't really perform that well. At 50 strength and faith, the faith-based seals would still be the better option. And another thing with the Blasphemous Blade, Bin actually does get some healing benefits with the skill and actually getting a kill. You actually can pair this alongside with some other types of healing-based effects and talismans, and you actually can make a pretty cool health regen type of build as well. Now, as for the Darkmoon Greatsword, this also gets a B scaling in intelligence, but it does get those D scalings in strength and dexterity. But the thing is, the B scaling that the Darkmoon Greatsword gets is better than the B scaling that the Blasphemous Blade gets. I don't know, the scalings are just shit in this fucking game. But the way to look at it is that the Darkmoon Greatsword really gets like an A scaling in intelligence, which this is both good and bad. Now, the reason as to why it's bad is because, once again, your total overall damage is going to be lacking. As soon as you go into like 80, 90 intelligence, putting points into strength and dexterity at that point isn't going to really benefit you as much as it would be putting points into the Blasphemous Blade strength and dexterity, which that really is only going to benefit you at like level 200 or level 300, because before that, you're just perfectly fine just going all into intelligence. because one, your heavy attacks are just going to scale up intelligence, so you don't really have to worry about wasted stats in that area. And once again, your spells, being that you're just going to go into the intelligence-based build, your spells are just going to be doing more damage. Now, a couple other things that I do want to talk about is power stancing potential. I think the Darkmoon Greatsword also has this one as well, because you can power stance this alongside the Health and Steeple, which is like another frost-based weapon. You can throw that one to the offhand, also use that weapon skill buff. Whereas for the Blasphemous Blade, it doesn't really have that same power stancing potential. The only other weapon that I could think of that you could really power sense alongside with this would be the Inseparable Sword. Now, if you did want to do holy damage, I guess, then go ahead. But I feel like the Health and Steeple is just a better power sensing option. And also another thing, being that the projectile is actually tied to your heavy attack, you actually can pair this alongside a shield. Now, earlier in the video, you did see me actually pair this alongside the Jellyfish Shield, which just adds more damage, which that way you actually can just leave the shield equipped, have more damage, and actually use your projectiles at the exact same time. Now, shields are going to be a lot heavier and actually going to force you to spec into just more endurance. And with the Jellyfish Shield, actually does have a higher strength and dexterity requirements, although it's not too bad. You can just two-hand it by just speccing into 14 dexterity and strength. But the fact that the Darkmoon Greatsword just gets better synergy across the board, except for extremely higher levels, I'm probably going to end up leaning more towards that one. Now, next, I want to talk about crowd control, basically meaning how well you can actually clear out the entire room full of just trash mobs, which obviously Blasphemous Blade is going to do that a lot better because its weapon skill just goes through enemies, can go through walls sometimes, and every enemy that it hits, it'll just give you health back. So yeah, it just does it a lot better than the Darkmoon Greatsword because that projectile attack doesn't really go through enemies and rarely even hits multiple enemies at once. Obviously, it can still perform very well because it is a free projectile attack that can do nice damage, but the Blasphemous Blade just does this a lot better. Now, next, I want to talk about special effects. Now, with the Darkmoon Greatsword, this actually does get a status effect of Frost. Actually gets 55 Frost build up, and with the weapon skill, it actually adds an additional 15. Now, Frost is just amazing to have because it's just 20% more damage you actually end up doing. And most enemies in the game actually can proc Frost against, which obviously is going to be really nice. Now, as for the Blasphemous Blade, it actually doesn't get any status effects, which is unfortunate, but it actually does get the special effect of just more health regen for every single kill and for every single hit with the weapon skill itself. Now, you don't even need to get a kill with the weapon itself to actually benefit off the heal. You can just have it in your offhand, which is going to be really cool, and it'll just be 4% more healing. And hitting with the weapon skill itself is going to heal you for 10% max HP and a flat 150, which honestly is just kind of crazy. The fact that you can heal for that much on every single hit with a projectile is kind of stupid. Now, for me personally, I would just rather have the more damage that the Darkmoon Greatsword actually does get. But one thing that you actually got to keep in mind is that when you have an intelligence-based build, you already have access to things like Frost. So you can use things like Zamor Ice Storm or Glintstone Icecrag, which are probably my favorite things to proc Frost with in terms of spells. These things can do it just as well, honestly. Whereas Blasphemous Blade, there's nothing really that actually works like this. And the healing-based benefits you do get out the Blasphemous Blade can actually stack with all the other base health regen stuff. So being that it is actually incredibly unique, I probably would end up leaning more towards the Blasphemous Blade special effect over the Darkmoon Greatsword. And another thing, it actually works on almost every single enemy, whereas for Frost, it doesn't really work that way. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is the damage types. Now, we have basically fire versus magic. I do have a whole dedicated video talking about the damage types themselves. Now, fire damage actually has a bunch more enemies that are actually weak to it compared to magic, but there actually are a lot more enemies that are resist to fire damage as well, because enemies like Radagon and Millennia are weak to fire damage. But in terms of enemies that are resist, you have guys like Moog, which is 80%, Rykard as well, even though he's like a gimmick boss, so that doesn't really matter. But Fire Giant, Godskin Duo, all these enemies are resist to fire. Whereas for magic damage, it's pretty neutral. The only enemies that are really resistant are the ones in like Leonia of the Lakes. Renala is going to be like the biggest one at 80% resist. Whereas like the only bosses that are actually like weaker to magic damage will be like the Gargoyles, which for me, I just tend to prefer to have that type of damage type because I just like to have more neutrality. So when I go up against enemies like the Fire Giant or Moog, I want to be able to shred them just as well. And the funny thing is, being that Millennia and Radagon are actually weaker to fire damage, the Darkmoon Greatswords can still actually outdamage it on those bosses as well, which is pretty funny. But this category itself is kind of useless because Faith does actually have the option to a bunch of different types of spells, but if you didn't really want to use spells, then being stuck with fire damage is going to suck a lot more than being stuck with magic damage in my opinion. So if I were to pick one, I guess I'll just go with the Darkmoon here. Okay, so the total score is currently 3-3, and I need to have a winner, and we don't really have another category, so I'm just going to pick a bunch of just random stuff to fire off. The Blasphemous Blade gets a little bit more range, the Darkmoon Greatsword is lighter, the Blasphemous Blade you can block with it a bit better, although I don't really recommend doing that. The Blasphemous Blade also does get the better moveset, because when you have the buff not active with the Darkmoon Greatsword, those heavy attacks are just shit, whereas the Darkmoon Greatsword at least has some decent heavy attacks. So overall, I guess I'm just going to give this random category to the Blasphemous Blade. So yes, 4-3, the Blasphemous Blade wins. In my opinion, I still would rather have the Darkmoon Greatsword, despite me being a person that likes Faith more. I just like to have the Darkmoon Greatsword over the Blasphemous Blade because I just like to have damage. Damage is the most important thing for me because I don't really care much for health regen because obviously I play the game a lot. It doesn't matter to me. But if you're a person that wants a more easy to use weapon that can just heal on every single hit and you have a grand old time that way, then yes, the Blasphemous Blade is going to be better for you. Anyway, that's that. Yes, let me know down in the comments what your opinions are, and do follow me on Twitch as well because I actually am live there every single day, and do subscribe here, please. We have more videos coming along the way. Definitely do that.